The winter wind crept across the tattered edges of the Allied forward camp, like a patient predator, slipping through canvas seams, rattling metal canisters, and carrying with it the metallic ghost scent of distant artillery. In this twilight of a war that still refused to die, Corporal Edwin Hale, a radio technician barely old enough to shave without cutting himself, huddled over a stubborn field transmitter whose innards sparked like a half-broken heart. Around him, the men spoke in low, worn voices, trading rumors that the German listening posts had grown sharper, hungrier, almost omniscient in the past weeks, intercepting Allied signals with unnerving precision. Hale listened without listening, fingers numbed by cold, yet moving, with the instinctive grace of someone who understood machines better than people. He knew that walls had ears, but in wartime even the empty forest did too, and he felt them now, these unseen listeners, breathing with every static pop from the radio. He wondered how many unrecorded tragedies had begun with the careless flick of a switch, the click of a transmitter. The whisper of a voice, meant only for friendly lines that instead spilled into enemy hands like blood into snow. Hale had always been told he was too hesitant, too thoughtful, too slow to act in a world where hesitation meant dying and action meant killing. Yet his slowness was nothing more than a refusal to let fear outrun logic. He took nothing for granted. Not the weight of a battery, not the feel of a dial, not even the tone of his own breathing as he leaned closer to the faint hum of the device on the table. Lieutenant Carter, a man who seemed carved from impatience itself, paced behind him, muttering that the night's reconnaissance orders should have already gone out 5 minutes ago. But Hale heard another sound beneath the static, a familiar tremor, the one that sometimes warned him the transmitter was on the verge of betraying them. The Germans were triangulating faster these days, Carter had spat earlier, claiming some new equipment on their side allowed them to pinpoint Allied broadcasts in under 90 seconds. Hale didn't know if that was true, but he did know their luck wouldn't hold much longer. Something had to change, something small, something simple, something that would make the enemy doubt their own ears for once, instead of the Allies doubting every breath they took. He pulled the heavy battery pack free, feeling its cold weight settle into his palm like a question he had not yet answered. Fear rippled through him, but it was not fear of death. It was fear of error, fear of making a mistake that would bury men whose names he knew, whose laughter he recognized in the dark, whose futures were already fraying thin. The manuals offered no comfort. The regulations offered even less. A radio manual had been written for a world where machines behaved, where war was logical, where the enemy followed predictable patterns. But Hale had watched this war bend reality until it looked like a distorted reflection in broken glass, and he had realized that sometimes survival came from stepping outside the lines drawn by men who were already dead. He turned the battery over, inspected the contacts, considered the wiring, and in a quiet moment that felt almost sacrilegious, he thought, what if the machine didn't broadcast the way it always did? What if it transmitted slightly wrong? Wrong enough to mislead? Wrong enough to confuse? Wrong enough to buy them time? Carter scoffed at him, calling the idea stupid, reckless, pointless. A backward battery flip would either stop the radio entirely or create a distorted signal that wouldn't carry, he said with the confidence of someone who had never cracked open a transmitter himself. Hale didn't argue. He didn't need Carter's approval. He only needed a chance to test a theory that had taken shape in his mind during the long, sleepless nights when fear felt like electricity and thought hummed louder than sleep. He reversed the battery, just a small inversion, barely noticeable, but immediately the radio changed tone, shifting from a clean, piercing hum to something deeper, grainier, imperfect. Hale's breath caught. Imperfection was the point. Imperfection was camouflage. Imperfection was survival. When Carter reluctantly gave permission to send the transmission, Hale pressed the key and let the distorted signal spill into the air like a wounded bird. He imagined it traveling across the frozen landscape toward the German listening posts, scattered like silent vultures on the ridges beyond. He imagined their operators leaning in, hearing the familiar Allied code, but through a filter that made it sound distant, doubled, offset by a strange echo that did not match the usual frequency signature. Hale waited. The seconds elongated, and in that stretched silence he understood that war hinged not on grand strategies or heroic charges, but on tiny moments of doubt planted inside the enemy's perception. Moments that caused them to question their instruments, their assumptions, their own certainty. Unbeknownst to him, 4 separate German posts would log the signal that night, each confident they were hearing something genuine, yet disagreeing violently about the source, the distance, the direction. Hale's stupid battery flip would scatter their calculations by miles, leading them into arguments, delays, and fruitless triangulations. But for now, Hale simply exhaled, unaware of what he had done, unaware of how fate can pivot on the smallest mechanical rebellion. The cold pressed in, but he felt something warm at his core, a faint ember of possibility. Perhaps stupidity, when touched by desperation and guided by intuition, was simply another word for innovation. If you're following this intense first part, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Morning bled slowly into the camp, grey and reluctant, as if the sun itself feared to look upon what war had made of men. The frost clung to the radio tower cables like veins of glass, and Corporal Edwin Hale's fingers, raw from the previous night's work, trembled as he coaxed the transmitter back to life. His stupid battery flip had held. The radio worked, not perfectly, but in its strange new imperfection lay a mystery the enemy could not untangle. No alarms had sounded overnight. No shelling had come in answer to their signal. For the first time in weeks, the silence that followed a transmission felt like safety instead of doom. Yet silence, Hale knew, was a dangerous comfort. It could cradle hope or conceal catastrophe. Lieutenant Carter appeared, looking as though he hadn't slept, his breath visible in the brittle morning air. He clapped Hale on the shoulder, not in praise, but as one man acknowledging another's narrow escape. "You got lucky," Carter muttered, lighting a cigarette, whose flame seemed too bright against the pale horizon. But luck was never what Hale trusted. He had seen luck die in the mud, tangled with corpses who had prayed for it. What he believed in was the quiet logic of chaos, the way one broken detail could disrupt an entire chain of certainty. Somewhere across the line, he imagined the German operators poring over their equipment, trying to reconcile the odd waveform that had entered their logs. Maybe one of them would suspect sabotage. Maybe another would call it a malfunction. The truth didn't matter. Confusion was victory. By midday, the camp stirred with unusual energy. A reconnaissance team returned with word that German artillery had shelled an empty field 20 miles from its intended target. Hale said nothing, but inside him, something fluttered. The realization that his small act of defiance had rippled outward, invisible but powerful. The enemy had listened to a ghost. The radio had lied beautifully. For the first time, he felt what it meant to fight without firing a shot, to wound not flesh, but perception itself. It was a quiet victory, one that would never make it into official reports, because armies rarely celebrated the accidents that saved them. As dusk fell again, Hale found himself alone with the transmitter, listening to its irregular hum. He began to experiment. Small adjustments, measured distortions, playing with the boundaries of signal and static, like a composer searching for dissonance that could confuse the ear. Each time he altered the circuit, he pictured the ripples spreading through enemy lines, their direction finders spinning like compasses trapped in storms. He realized that war was not only about strength or numbers or even strategy. It was about perception. Who could see clearly and who could make the other blind? His stupidity was now a weapon, sharper than steel, invisible as thought. Yet every act of deception bore a cost. That night, when Carter asked him to send a coded message to command, Hale hesitated. He was no longer sure which signals were truly theirs, and which were ghosts of his own making. The boundaries between truth and trickery had begun to blur. He stared at the dial, wondering if in confusing the enemy, he had also begun to lose the clarity within himself. But when the first shells thundered far to the east, nowhere near their camp, Hale's doubts were drowned by the realization that his work had bought them another night to breathe. He looked out into the dark and thought about the unseen enemy across the hills. The faceless listeners hunched over their machines, just as he was now, trying to decode meaning from noise. Perhaps they too were cold and tired. Perhaps they too were haunted by the invisible weight of what they did. And perhaps that was the cruel symmetry of war. Men on both sides building towers of sound and silence, trying to listen their way towards survival. He smiled faintly, a weary, private smile. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to matter. Yet in the static between life and death, he had found a kind of authorship, the power to rewrite the battlefield with nothing more than a flipped battery and an act of quiet disobedience. If you've reached this far and felt the tension build, consider subscribing. More stories like this await, where courage is found not in gunfire, but in the pulse of human ingenuity. The following days unfolded like a fever dream of frost, mud, and invisible duels waged through the airwaves. Hale became a phantom craftsman, sculpting deception out of electricity and error, perfecting the unperfected. What had begun as an accident, a flipped battery, a moment of rebellion against the ordinary, grew into a method, a rhythm. He tuned his radio not to clarity, but to confusion, learning how to bend signals until they danced just beyond the reach of German instruments. The trick was not to jam or silence the frequencies. It was to seduce them, to whisper half-truths in the language of static, to make the enemy believe they were hearing something real while chasing the shadow of a lie. Each night, the camp's men slept beneath an uneasy quiet, unaware that their safety depended on a hum in the dark. Hale began keeping a notebook, not of military codes or coordinates, but of sounds, the pitch of interference when the wind shifted east, the tremor in the tone when moisture seeped into the cables, the subtle difference between a healthy frequency and one pretending to be. He was becoming something else, not merely a technician, but an artist of distortion, painting misdirection across the sky. Yet he could not escape the growing unease inside him, the sense that this invisible game carried an invisible cost. The Germans were adapting. Reports came in of increased signal sweeps, of mobile listening units prowling the countryside with new antenna rigs. The enemy, it seemed, had begun to suspect the existence of a phantom frequency, a trickster's voice in the ether that lured them toward false coordinates. Some Allied officers dismissed it as coincidence, but Hale knew better. He could feel the attention tightening around him like a net. Every time he transmitted, he imagined their triangulation teams turning dials, narrowing their scopes, waiting for him to make one mistake. One evening, as the snow thickened to a blind white curtain, Hale was ordered to transmit an urgent message to the reconnaissance units positioned near the Ardennes line. The frequency was familiar, but something in his gut resisted. He hesitated. Carter barked at him, demanding haste. "They need those coordinates now," the lieutenant snapped. Hale's fingers hovered over the key. What if the Germans were already locked on this channel? What if his act of communication, meant to save lives, brought artillery down upon them instead? He could feel the pulse in his temples. The war had turned every act of connection into a potential betrayal. He flipped the battery again, altering the polarity by a fraction, and began to send. The radio crackled with an almost human voice, faint, warbled, ghostly. When the message ended, Hale leaned back, exhausted. For a moment, silence hung heavy. Then, faint through the static, came something he had never heard before. A reply, not in Allied code, not in any language he recognized fully, but a distorted mimicry of his own transmission. It was as if someone, somewhere, had replayed his signal back to him, warped and delayed. His blood ran cold. The Germans were answering. They had heard him. The following day, the Allied intercept units confirmed strange echoes bouncing along the same wavelength. The enemy had begun experimenting with counter-deception, sending mirrored messages, layered with false coordinates of their own. Hale's own trick had come full circle, reflected back at him like a curse. He realized that in teaching the enemy confusion, He had also taught them creativity. Now, both sides were tangled in an invisible dialogue of lies, each trying to outwit the other through noise. In the long, sleepless hours that followed, Hale sat alone beside the transmitter, the tent lit only by a trembling lamp. He thought of his mother's voice, soft and far away, of a world where sound carried warmth instead of death. He wondered if, when this was over, he would ever be able to hear silence again without flinching. The war had invaded even the air itself, turning every vibration into a weapon. Somewhere in the static, he thought he could still hear the echo of that eerie reply, haunting him like a question he could never answer. He began to write a message he would never send, a confession of sorts, about how a stupid battery flip had changed the course of things, how he no longer knew whether his cleverness had saved lives or merely prolonged the suffering. But before he could finish, the camp's warning sirens screamed through the night. The Germans had found something, or someone, worth their shells. The first explosions tore through the valley minutes later, the ground trembling with the fury of precision artillery. Hale's radio flared once more, its dials glowing like the eyes of a dying god. As he dove for cover, the transmitter sparked, caught fire, and died. His weapon, his secret, his strange art of distortion, gone in a bloom of smoke and light. But deep inside him, Hale knew the signal had not died. It had already gone farther than anyone could track, bouncing endlessly between listening posts, a wandering echo in the dark. Proof that even the smallest defiance can outlive the man who created it. The bombardment tore through the night like an angry god clawing at the earth. Each explosion stitched the darkness with orange fire. Each shockwave rolled through the camp like thunder swallowed whole. Hale stumbled through the mud, ears ringing, lungs burning with the smoke of shattered timber and diesel. Somewhere behind him, the radio tent collapsed in a shriek of fabric and flame. The transmitter, the last version of his imperfect masterpiece, was gone. He fell to his knees near the wreckage, half mad with the thought that maybe this was justice, maybe the war had finally caught up to his defiance. Around him men shouted, some calling for medics, others for ammunition, all for something to hold on to in a night that had no mercy. When dawn came, it revealed a landscape that barely remembered it had once been a camp. The frost had melted into ash. The trees stood black and leafless, their branches skeletal against the grey sky. Hale found the charred shell of the transmitter beneath a pile of debris. The metal was twisted beyond recognition. The wires melted into veins of copper glass. He reached out and touched the ruin, not out of hope, but reverence, as if saying goodbye to a fallen comrade. Lieutenant Carter approached from the smoke, face smeared with dirt and disbelief. "We weren't supposed to be found," he rasped, voice hoarse. Hale didn't answer. He couldn't. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet realization formed. The Germans hadn't found them by luck. They had found them because of the game he had begun. The echoes, the mirrored signals. The deception had become a loop, a self-consuming fire. His trick had evolved, reflected, replicated, a ghost bouncing between both armies, guiding shells toward confusion, feeding both sides the same false promise of clarity. Hale felt sick with understanding. He had made a machine of doubt, and now that machine had learned to live on its own. Carter stared at him for a long moment, as if reading the confession written in his eyes, but said nothing. Orders came by runner. The survivors were to retreat north by dawn. The line had broken somewhere east, and they were to rejoin what remained of their unit near Bastogne. The march was endless. Snow began again, soft flakes landing on blood-darkened mud, trying and failing to make it clean. Hale walked like a man haunted by a ghost only he could hear. The others spoke little, each trapped inside his own exhaustion. Every distant rumble could have been thunder or artillery or imagination. To Hale, it all sounded like static, the same endless, restless noise that had filled his nights for months. He wondered whether the war would sound quieter when it ended, or if silence itself had been permanently broken. On the third night, they found refuge in an abandoned farmhouse. The roof had half caved in, and the air inside smelled of damp wood and old sorrow. Hale sat near the window, staring at the shattered remains of a shortwave receiver left behind by its previous owners. Something inside him refused to rest until he knew whether the ghost of his signal still lived. He spent hours repairing the radio, scavenging wires from lanterns, batteries from flashlights. The others thought him mad, but madness, in war, was simply persistence that refused to die. When at last the radio hummed to life, its voice was faint and distant, but alive. Hale turned the dial, slowly, carefully, until he heard something, a faint, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat wrapped in fog. It wasn't Allied code. It wasn't German either. It was the echo, his echo, the same distorted cadence he had created with that first inverted battery. It was still out there, wandering the frequencies like a lost soul. He listened for a long time, numb and mesmerized. Somewhere, perhaps miles away, perhaps continents, another man was hearing the same thing. Another operator, another weary soul. And each of them believed the other was the enemy. Hale closed his eyes. The hum filled him, warm and terrifying. He realized that the radio war had become its own organism, a living current of fear and confusion stretching across Europe, sustained by both sides' hunger to listen, to control, to know. What he had built in desperation was no longer his. It belonged to the war now, as everything eventually did. Before dawn, Hale dismantled the receiver again and scattered its pieces into the snow. He could not bear the idea of feeding the echo one more time, but even as he walked away, he felt its presence, whispering through the wind, the ghost frequency that would never die, the sound of a mistake that had become a myth. The men marched on through the frozen dawn, unaware that they were walking beneath invisible waves of sound, carrying fragments of messages, lies, and echoes of the dead. Hale, though, heard it all, the living static of a world that could no longer remember silence. The road to Bastogne was a graveyard of wheels, helmets, and frozen hands still clutching the memory of rifles. The retreat had become an odyssey through silence and snow, where the wind carried the names of men who no longer answered. Hale trudged with the column, his boots heavy with mud that never seemed to let go, his mind flickering between exhaustion and the dull ache of realization that he was walking not towards safety, but deeper into the aftermath of what he had unleashed. Every time the wind shifted, he thought he heard the hum again, faint, almost tender, like the memory of his own invention mocking him from the ether. When they reached Bastogne, they found chaos wrapped in order, an entire pocket of resistance surrounded by steel and cold. Radios hummed in every corner of the makeshift headquarters, desperate voices clawing through static for commands, reinforcements, anything. Hale, dirty and half-deaf from the shelling, was recognized by a signal officer who had heard rumors of the technician who made ghosts. They pulled him into a bunker lit by lanterns and fever, thrusting a receiver in front of him. "They're hearing strange Allied signals in the northern sector," the officer said. "Coordinates that don't match any known operation. We think it's German deception. Could you help decode?" Hale's stomach turned. He already knew what they were hearing. The familiar distortion danced through the air like an old melody played on a broken instrument. It was his signal, altered, stretched, but unmistakable. The echo had reached them. Across the bunker, men bent over their maps, trying to make sense of coordinates that meant nothing and everything. Hale could almost see the invisible hands on the other side, German operators chasing the same phantom, convinced it was the Allies who were lying. The circle was complete, both armies, guided by ghosts, both sides believing they were in control. He should have confessed. He should have told them the truth, that this strange music of static and distortion was born not from enemy cunning, but from one man's foolish defiance in a frozen tent. But as he opened his mouth, a different thought crept in, terrible and intoxicating. Maybe the echo could still be used. If both sides were lost in its maze, perhaps he could twist it again, one last time, to lead the Germans away from Bastogne. Maybe his curse could still become a shield. For hours he worked, his fingers trembling with fatigue and fear, splicing wires, adjusting dials, sending carefully warped transmissions through frequencies already poisoned by his invention. Each signal he released was another illusion, another lie layered atop the first, a labyrinth built of sound. The men around him called him a genius, unaware that genius and guilt often shared the same face. As the night deepened, he sent one final message. Coordinates reversed, tone bent, pulse imperfect. A trap disguised as a beacon. And somewhere out there, 4 German listening posts received it, each interpreting it differently, each convinced they had found the enemy's position. The shelling began at dawn, but not on Bastogne. The reports came in staggered and disbelieving. German artillery had struck empty woods 20 kilometers off target. Confusion spread like fire among their ranks. For a brief, impossible moment, the Allies in Bastogne caught their breath. Hale sat slumped beside his transmitter, hands shaking, eyes hollow. He had bought them time. Again. His stupidity had saved them once more. Carter found him later, staring into the radio's dying glow. "You did it," he said softly, voice stripped of arrogance. "You fooled them again." Hale didn't answer. He could still hear the echo pulsing faintly, bouncing between frequencies like a restless spirit. He realized it would never stop now. It would wander long after the last gun fell silent, a ghost without allegiance, whispering confusion into the ruins of peace. That night, when the stars finally broke through the smoke, Hale stepped outside the bunker and looked toward the frozen horizon. The air was painfully still. For the first time in months, no shells fell, no sirens wailed. Just the slow, deep silence of reprieve. Yet even then, beneath that silence, he thought he could hear it. The faint, endless murmur of the signal that refused to die, the child of his disobedience, still calling out across a wounded sky. He wondered if someday, long after the uniforms had turned to dust, some wandering signalman might pick up that strange hum and wonder where it came from. Maybe they'd think it was a remnant of war. Maybe they'd think it was a ghost. Maybe they'd be right. The siege dragged on like a fever dream, a rhythm of hunger and hope, of snow that never stopped falling, and of men who refused to die simply because they had run out of strength to keep doing so. Bastogne became a frozen island of defiance. The air was thick with the metallic scent of ammunition and the low, ever-present hum of radios, the heartbeat of a city surrounded by death. Hale barely slept. His hands had turned to trembling ghosts of flesh, but still he worked, soldering fragments of broken transmitters, scavenging parts from the dead, rebuilding the invisible armor of distortion that now shielded them. He no longer spoke to anyone except through machines. Words had become dangerous. Sound was safer when it was abstract, coded, unreadable. Carter had changed too. The lieutenant's arrogance had burned away in the crucible of survival. He trusted Hale now, but with a wary reverence, as one might trust a storm that had saved your life once, but could destroy you just as easily. "You're the only one who can keep them guessing," he said one night, his voice quiet over the clatter of distant gunfire. "Without your ghosts, we're blind." Hale nodded, but said nothing. There was no pride left in what he did. The line between hero and heretic had long since dissolved. He knew the Germans were listening still, tracing his phantom signals, trying to decode his lies. Theirs was a relationship now, 2 unseen minds locked in a dance of deception, bound by mutual obsession. Each night, Hale felt their presence more vividly. When he adjusted frequencies, he imagined the German operators doing the same, mirroring his every move like a reflection in dark water. Sometimes he would alter a signal just slightly, adding a pulse of rhythm or a minor distortion, not as a trick, but as a message, a whisper, only they would notice. It became his strange way of communicating, an unspoken confession to the enemy. "I know you're there. I know you hear me. Perhaps," He thought they understood. Perhaps on the other end of the line sat another man like him, tired, clever, scared, just trying to outlast the noise. Then, one night, a reply came. It was faint, broken, but deliberate. A signal not in German, not in Allied code, but in pattern. 3 short pulses, 2 long, then 1 soft, low tone. Not an order, not a deception, just acknowledgement. Hale froze. His heart hammered. He had been answered. The enemy was no longer faceless. Somewhere across the front, in another bunker, another pair of trembling hands had reached out through the static and touched his. The realization cracked something inside him. He leaned into the microphone, voice trembling as he sent back a reply. Meaningless to command, but to him, a message of fragile humanity. 3 pulses, 2 long, 1 soft. An echo returned. From that night onward, the war took on a surreal intimacy. Between bombardments, between orders, the 2 operators continued their silent correspondence. Signals stripped of language, yet full of meaning. It wasn't peace, but it was something like understanding. Hale began to believe that maybe this, too, was resistance. To remain human in the heart of madness, to refuse to let the war consume every frequency of compassion. But war, like static, devours everything. The following week, the Germans launched a final offensive to break through the frozen ring around Bastogne. The bombardment returned with a fury unmatched, and Hale's bunker shook beneath the weight of it. He tried to send a new signal, but the lines were collapsing, his equipment sputtered, the battery dying, the air thick with dust and smoke. Amid the chaos, he sent one last transmission, not coordinates, not code, just that same pattern of pulses he had shared with the unseen German operator. A farewell in the only language left to them. The shell hit before he finished. The world turned white. When the sound cleared, there was only the ringing, endless, high, like a tone stretched into eternity. The bunker was gone. The transmitter lay in ruin, the wires glowing faintly like veins under dying skin. Hale lay half buried in debris, the breath shallow in his chest, his blood black against the frost. His ears bled, but still, faintly, through the ruin, he thought he heard the echo again. 3 short, 2 long, 1 soft. A reply. He smiled. In the end, he had not died unheard. Even if it came from the enemy, someone had answered. In the language of noise and silence, that was enough. When the smoke finally lifted from Bastogne, it revealed a landscape that looked less like victory and more like the aftermath of some forgotten punishment from the gods. Trees had been reduced to blackened bones, houses to splinters. Snow fell again, soft, indifferent, trying in vain to cover the wounds of men and earth alike. In the ruins of what had been the signal bunker, a recovery unit moved slowly, stepping carefully over the bodies of those who had sent messages the world would never hear. They found Hale beneath a beam of twisted metal, his face pale but peaceful, his hands still resting near the radio's charred remains. One of the soldiers, a young private with shaking fingers, bent down and brushed the frost from the broken dials. To his surprise, the radio still hummed, faintly, impossibly, as if refusing to die. He tapped the side of the casing, and through the damaged speakers came a soft rhythm, distorted and far away. 3 short pulses, 2 long, 1 soft. The men froze. None of them recognized it as code. They thought it was interference from some distant transmitter. But it wasn't. It was Hale's final message, still wandering the frequencies, still calling to no one and to everyone at once. Carter arrived soon after, his face hollow, his voice stripped of command. He knelt beside Hale and removed his helmet in silence. Around him, the men murmured stories, how this quiet technician had fooled the Germans, how his stupid battery trick had saved hundreds, maybe thousands. None of them knew the full truth, the invisible chain of deception and understanding that had stretched across battle lines. They would never know about the echo that had turned enemies into brief companions in the dark. They would only remember the miracle that the enemy's guns had missed their mark, that somehow Bastogne had endured. Carter ordered Hale's body carried out and buried on a hill overlooking the forest. The ground was frozen, hard as iron, but the men dug anyway. They placed the burned remains of the radio beside him, wrapped carefully in canvas, as if burying a friend. "He made the static work for us," Carter said softly. "He made the war listen to him." The words carried through the cold like a prayer, honest and uncertain. Weeks later, as the front pushed east and the Germans retreated, Allied intercept units began reporting strange signals echoing across the frequencies. They were faint, irregular, but patterned. 3 short pulses, 2 long, 1 soft. At first, they thought it was leftover interference from destroyed transmitters, but the pattern persisted, repeating at odd intervals, moving from band to band, across hundreds of miles. No one could trace it. Some said it was a glitch. Others swore it was a message from lost Allied units. One old operator, listening one night in France, whispered that it was the sound of a man refusing to be forgotten. And so, even after the war ended, the echo continued. It outlived the guns, the trenches, the flags. It drifted into the new air of peace, haunting the radios of civilians, sailors, and explorers. Some claim to hear it in the Arctic, others in the deserts of Africa. A faint, rhythmic pulse hidden beneath the chatter of the modern world. 3 short, 2 long, 1 soft. A heartbeat that belonged to no nation, no army, no side. Only to memory. Years later, in a museum in London, a restored field transmitter was displayed under glass, labelled simply, "The Hale device. Source unknown." Tourists passed it without pause, unaware that if the room grew quiet enough, if one leaned close to the old metal shell, one might still hear the ghostly hum of a frequency that refused to fade. The heartbeat of a man who once believed that even in war, a small act of disobedience could bend the noise of destruction towards something resembling hope. And somewhere, perhaps nowhere, in the endless static between stars, the signal still travels, circling the earth like a lost prayer, whispering its rhythm to whoever will listen. 3 short, 2 long, 1 soft. The sound of a mistake that saved the living and taught even the dead how to answer. If this story reached you, if you felt its pulse in the quiet between words, give it life again. Like and subscribe so that Hale's echo and all those who dare to defy silence can still be heard.